My name is Lisa. I live in a small white house in Brooklyn, New York, on a street where the trees lean toward one another like old friends. The porch sags a little, but the swing still moves when the river wind finds it. At night, when the city hum fades just enough, I can hear the faint whistle of the East River ferries. It was here, in this house, that I found myself after my father died, surrounded by memories that clung to me like shadows. Grief does strange things to time. Days collapsed into nights, and nights stretched like highways without end. I spent most evenings sitting on that swing, counting the hours, the bills, the debts, and the sheer weight of being left behind. My father had always carried the name of our family like a torch, as though the world owed him respect because of what he built, or what he claimed to build. I thought he had left us stability, but I was soon to learn that stability in America is often just a story we tell ourselves, one transaction away from breaking. On a Monday morning, the kind that begins with sharp air and restless taxis, I gathered my bag and took the subway into Manhattan. The train roared through tunnels, and in every reflection, I saw my face. Pale, drawn, carrying the heaviness of loss and the quiet fear of what awaited me. The glass tower on 7th Avenue stood tall and shining, the kind of place my father entered like a king. For decades, he carried himself as though the building itself owed him allegiance. And for years, I trailed behind that legacy, never quite invited, never quite excluded. When I stepped into the CEO's office, the air smelled of polished wood and ambition. Charles Rhodes, the CEO, was behind his desk, neat as always, his tie perfectly knotted, his expression unreadable. But it wasn't Charles who stopped me. It was my brother, Mark. He was sitting comfortably in the chair across the desk, leaning back, smiling the kind of smile that burns more than it warms. "Lisa," he said, his voice too sweet, too rehearsed. "You're being fired from the company. There's no need for unsuccessful people here." He spoke it loudly, almost theatrically, as if he wanted the walls themselves to remember the sound. Charles looked down at his desk, his silence a kind of agreement. The city outside the tall windows kept moving, yellow cabs, honking horns, people rushing with coffee cups, but inside that room, time folded in on itself. Mark didn't stop there. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, savoring each word as though it were wine. "Father left everything to me. The house in Connecticut, the investment shares in Chicago, the small building in Miami, and the accounts are worth more than $12 million. And, of course, the company itself, our company, my company now." He let the words hang in the air like smoke. My chest tightened, but I kept my back straight. I had learned long ago that silence can be stronger than shouting. The room tilted around me, but I would not fall. I placed my hand on the strap of my bag, nodded once, firm, controlled, and turned toward the door. I left quietly. The lobby was full of men and women moving quickly in suits, but to me they looked like actors on a stage where the script had already been written. I stepped outside into the rush of Manhattan air, and for the first time in years, I felt the bite of cold not as pain, but as clarity. My father's shadow was gone. My brother's words still stung, but I walked toward the subway with a strange calm. That evening, I made tea in my kitchen, the kind with honey that coats the throat. The house was still, except for the tick of the old clock on the wall. I sat at the table, staring at the chipped paint, and finally reached for my phone. There was one person I trusted with truth, Olivia, my lawyer, and, more than that, my friend. When she answered, her voice carried the calm steadiness of someone who deals in facts, not feelings. "Lisa," she said. I told her what Mark had said, how he fired me, how he claimed everything was his. The words spilled out in a mix of anger and disbelief, but Olivia didn't rush me. She let me speak until the house was quiet again. Then she took a slow breath, the kind you take before you deliver something heavy. "Lisa, I was about to call you." Her words landed with weight. "What do you mean?" I asked. There was a pause, then her voice softened, steady as a safe harbor. "Because there is something you need to see." On Tuesday morning, the bomb exploded, not the kind that shatters glass and burns the skin, but the kind that tears apart illusions and leaves the truth bare. My brother thought he had closed the door on me the day before, when he told me I was fired. He thought he held every key, every dollar, every piece of our father's legacy. But Tuesday morning proved him wrong. I met Olivia in her office near the courthouse, a modest place with wood-paneled walls and shelves filled with leather-bound books that smelled faintly of dust and time. She had been my father's lawyer once, but she had always treated me with gentleness he never showed. When I walked in, she was already seated, a stack of papers neatly arranged in front of her. She gestured for me to sit, and her eyes told me that what I was about to hear would change everything. "Lisa," she said softly, "before we speak of what your brother claimed, I need you to see this." She slid the first paper across the desk, the will my father had signed last year. I had seen a copy of it before, but reading it again felt like swallowing glass. My father had written Mark's name into nearly every line: the houses, the accounts, the cars, and most importantly, the company. I had been reduced to a few tokens: a painting, a ring, an empty gesture. My throat tightened as I read the familiar words. "Now," Olivia said, pulling a second stack closer. "This is the part no one has spoken of." The paper she laid before me was older, the edges slightly yellowed, the ink dry but firm. The handwriting was strong, deliberate, the kind of hand that came from a man who believed in permanence. At the top, it read, "The last will and testament of Grand Panna, my father's father." "This," Olivia continued, tapping the page, "is the original will, and it changes everything." I read slowly, line by line, afraid I might miss a single word. Unlike my father's will, this document named me directly. Grand Panna had written my name with certainty, leaving me not scraps or tokens, but the very foundation of his legacy. The company, with all its holdings in New York, Chicago, and Miami, was mine. The rest of the estate, accounts worth millions, properties that stretched across cities, was placed in a trust for me to manage. I froze, staring at the paper. My father had always acted as though the company was his alone, as if he had built it out of sheer brilliance, fueled by charm and ambition. For years, I lived in his shadow, believing that I was lucky to stand near the fire. But the ink told another story. The company was never his to begin with. It had always been mine. Olivia's voice pulled me back. "Your father either misunderstood or chose to ignore this. He believed Grand Panna gave everything to him, but he was wrong. The law recognizes the original document. The later paperwork your brother waved around cannot undo this. And once we present it to the board, they will have no choice but to honor it." Her words struck me like lightning. For so long, I had thought of myself as the outsider, the one pushed to the margins. I was the daughter who sat quietly at the table, who listened to business conversations without being invited to speak, who heard my father praise Mark's every move while dismissing mine as trivial. Now the truth stood in front of me. I was not the outsider. I was the heir. I stood and walked to the window. From there, I could see the courthouse steps and beyond them, the rhythm of America on the move. Buses groaned at the corners, trucks rumbled past, and people hurried with their coffee cups, each chasing their own small piece of survival. For years, I had been a passenger in my own life, carried by other people's choices, drifting along in the wake of their power. But on that Tuesday, I felt the wheel in my hands for the first time. I turned back to Olivia. "So, what happens now?" She leaned back in her chair, folding her hands. "We file notice with the board immediately. They will convene within the week. You are, by every legal measure, the rightful owner of the company. Mark will be stripped of authority. He cannot contest this without making a fool of himself, and even then, the documents are ironclad. It will be a shock for him, but not nearly as much as it will be for you when you walk into that boardroom as the true heir." Her words made my stomach twist. Shock, yes, and fear, because power is not light to carry. But beneath the fear was something else, something long buried under grief and dismissal, a sense of justice. I thought of my father's office in the tower, the cold way Charles looked at me yesterday, the cruel smile on Mark's face. They had dismissed me as unsuccessful, unnecessary, a woman unfit to stand in the same room. Now I held the very proof that the empire they bowed to had been placed in my hands years ago. When I sat back down, Olivia slid another paper toward me. "This is your appointment as trustee of the estate. Sign here, and we begin the process." I picked up the pen. My hand trembled, but not from weakness. It trembled from the weight of knowing that once I signed, everything would change. Mark would lose the cars, the accounts, the illusion of power he had wrapped around himself. I would gain not only control of the company, but also the responsibility of shaping its future. The tip of the pen touched the page, and I signed my name. For a long moment, I simply stared at the black letters on white paper, letters that bound me to a legacy older than my own memory. I thought of Grand Panna, stern, distant, yet deliberate. Perhaps he had seen me clearly than my father ever did. Perhaps he had known that one day I would have to stand alone and lead. Olivia gathered the papers and placed them carefully in her case. "It begins now," she said. As I left her office, the wind outside was sharper, cutting against my coat, but I didn't pull it tighter. I let the cold hit my face. The city looked different, the streets brighter, the people clearer, as though a fog had lifted. For the first time, I wasn't walking in someone else's story. I was walking into mine. The morning I walked back into the tower, the city was already alive with its usual symphony of horns, footsteps, and hurried voices. The air carried that sharp Manhattan chill that bites, but also wakes you up. This time, I didn't feel like an intruder or a daughter walking in the shadows of her father's name. I walked with purpose, with the knowledge of the papers Olivia carried in her case. I wore a navy dress, simple but strong, and flats that did not slip. It wasn't a costume or an armor. It was me, as I was meant to be. At the revolving doors, I caught my reflection in the glass, tired but steady. For the first time, I believed I belonged inside. The lobby gleamed with polished marble. Men and women hurried to the elevators, clutching phones, whispering deals, living their ordinary Tuesday mornings. For them, it was another day of balance sheets and meetings. For me, it was the day the ground shifted. Claire from accounting was waiting near the elevators. She had always been kind, the sort of woman who remembered birthdays, who brought extra coffee when meetings dragged past noon. Her eyes widened when she saw me. "I knew you'd come," she whispered, her hand brushing mine for a second. "We've been waiting." Her words filled me with a quiet strength. Waiting, for me, for someone to set things right. The elevator ride to the 24th floor was silent except for the hum of cables. When the doors opened, I stepped out with Olivia beside me. She carried the file against her chest as if it were a torch. We moved past the rows of desks, past curious glances and whispered questions. I could feel the air shift as people noticed my presence. The boardroom door was heavy, but I pushed it open without hesitation. Inside, Charles Rhodes sat at the head of the long table. His tie was still perfect, his hair combed into obedience, but his eyes betrayed unease. Beside him were the directors, each with tablets and papers, ready for the routine agenda. On the large screen at the far end, 2 investors from London waited on a video call. Charles opened his mouth, but Olivia was faster. She placed the will on the table and said, "Please read this." The words felt like a command. The boardroom hushed. Even the vents seemed to quiet, as though the room itself leaned in. One by one, the directors leaned forward, scanning the lines of Grand Panna's original will. I watched their faces as certainty drained into disbelief. Fingers tapped nervously on the table, pens stopped moving, and at last, silence took over. When the final page was read, no one dared meet my eyes, except Claire, who had followed us inside and stood near the back, her chin lifted. I drew a breath, steady and deliberate. "I'm assuming the chair," I said, my voice cutting through the stillness. "Effective today." No one argued. Not Charles. Not the men on the screen from London who had invested £6 million the previous quarter. Not the bank officer from Boston who had flown in to oversee the company's loan negotiations. The papers left no room for debate. The company, its offices in New York, its trucks in Chicago, its leases in Los Angeles, was mine. I felt the weight of generations settle on my shoulders, but it did not crush me. It steadied me. "Bring in my brother," I said. 2 security officers stepped out and returned moments later with Mark. He entered the boardroom with that same hard smile he wore yesterday, the one that stung like a slap. But when his eyes fell on the papers spread across the table, the smile slipped, slow and unsteady, like ice melting under a hot sun. "You fired me yesterday," I said, locking eyes with him. "Today, I'm ending your role. Clean out your office. The driver will take you home. The company car stays." His mouth opened, his hands twitching as if he wanted to grab something that was no longer there. "Lisa, No," I said firmly. "Not today." The silence after my words was louder than his protests could have been. The directors looked away. The investors said nothing. For once, my brother was not the center of the room. I was. I signed 2 forms that Olivia had prepared. One stripped Mark of all company access, email, accounts, authority. The other appointed Claire as interim chief operating officer with a salary of $450,000. Claire blinked rapidly, tears shining in her eyes, but she nodded. She had always been the quiet backbone of the finance department, and now she would have the authority to match her integrity. Mark's face twisted, somewhere between anger and disbelief. He turned to Charles, but Charles's eyes stayed fixed on the table. No one came to his rescue.
He was alone now.
"Take him out," I said softly, and the security officers guided him toward the door. He didn't fight them. He just stared at me with eyes that begged for something I would not give. When the door closed behind him, I looked at the board. "This company will not be run on ego or deceit," I said. "We will run it with care and with clear books. We will honor every dollar and every hour worked. If you stay, you commit to this standard. If not, step aside." No one moved. No one spoke against me. The silence, once heavy, now felt like a scent. By evening, I was back on my porch in Brooklyn. The city lights glowed against the horizon, and the wind moved the swing gently, as if the house itself knew something had shifted. I sat with a notebook and wrote a message to the staff. "We will rebuild. We will be honest. Tomorrow we meet at 9 a.m. Bring ideas. Bring heart." I closed the notebook and set it on the table beside my tea. For the first time in years, I felt the ground beneath me was steady, not because it was easy, but because it was mine. The night was quiet except for the faint hum of traffic, and I thought of Grand Pana, of my father, of all the men who had held the keys before me. They had carried power like a shield. I would carry it differently, like a responsibility. And as I looked out at the city, I knew this was only the beginning. The weeks that followed were not calm, but they were clear. Leading a company is like standing in the middle of a storm and deciding where the lightning should strike. Every day brought decisions that carried weight. What to cut, what to build, whom to trust. Yet in that storm, there was also sunrise, new beginnings that lit up what had once been hidden. We opened the books with honest eyes. What we found was worse than I had imagined. My father had spent millions on vanity projects in Miami, expensive offices with glass walls that no one worked in, cars leased for executives who rarely visited, dinners that cost more than some of our workers made in a month. It was rot disguised as luxury. I made the choice quickly. We ended those contracts and moved the money into fair pay for our teams. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. The debts were heavy, too, more than $2,300,000 hanging over us like storm clouds. Some on the board whispered that we should hide it, delay the reckoning, pretend the rain was just a drizzle. But I refused. We faced it head on. Within weeks, we had restructured payments, sold off wasteful assets, and begun paying down the debt. For the first time in years, our books reflected reality, not illusion. Word spread, quietly at first, then louder. Our partners in Europe, investors who had grown weary of my father's showmanship, sent a short email that made me smile. It said only, "At last cents." For them, it was proof that America could produce more than ego. It could produce honesty. But outside the boardroom, the story took a more personal turn. One night, I heard a knock at my door. My house in Brooklyn, small and steady, had become my refuge. The porch light cast a soft glow as I opened the door and found Mark standing there. He looked smaller than I remembered, not in height but in spirit. His suit was wrinkled, his hair untidy. He stood on the steps but did not cross the line onto the porch. It was as if he knew this was no longer his space. "Lisa," he said, his voice low. "I'm sorry." The words hung heavy between us. For years, he had never spoken them. Not to me, not to anyone. He had always believed power was his shield, that he could cut with words and never bleed himself. But now, standing there, he looked wounded. "I thought power would make me strong," he admitted, his eyes downcast. "But it only made me hungry. Always hungry. Now I have nothing. No car. No driver. I had to sell my watch for $4,200 just to pay rent this month." His voice cracked on the last word. He looked up then, his eyes searching mine. "Help me, Lisa. Please." The silence between us stretched long. I thought of the boy he once was, the brother who had played with me in the yard before ambition took him. I thought of the man he had become, the one who smiled in the CEO's office as he told me I was fired. "I won't punish you," I said at last. My voice was steady, but not unkind. "But I won't save you either. You need to learn, Mark. And so do the ones who are listening to this story, the viewers who believe there is always an easy turn. There is no easy turn. There is only the right turn, and you make it with your own hands." He nodded once, slowly, as if each movement cost him something. Then he turned and walked down the steps. The streetlights flickered on one by one, glowing like slow stars. I watched until he disappeared into the shadows. I went back inside. The house was quiet, but it did not feel empty. The walls seemed to breathe with me, steady and calm. At the kitchen table, I pulled out a notebook and began to write plans for the morning. A new training program in Chicago, where young workers need skills to rise higher. A childcare grant for staff in New York, so mothers and fathers could work without fear of choosing between family and survival. A fair contract for the drivers in Los Angeles, whose long hours had gone unrecognized for too long. A visit to the small plant near the river, where old machines still clattered and old hands still guided them like instruments of music. I wrote each plan carefully, placing numbers beside them in dollars and pounds, balancing the budget like a scale until it sat level. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Honesty, I realized, was the rarest currency of all. When I finished, I closed the notebook and let my hand rest on the cover. I looked around my house, the small living room with its worn couch, the kitchen that smelled faintly of tea and wood, the porch swing waiting outside. It was not a mansion in Connecticut or a tower on 7th Avenue. But it was mine, just as the company was mine now, just as my story was mine to tell. And this is my story. I am the one telling it, in my own voice, in simple words, from a porch in America. I did not ask to hold the keys. I did not beg for this path. But when the door opened, I walked through it. Step by step, I built my place not on promises, but on truth. Mark's lesson was his to learn. Mine was different. Mine was knowing that legacy is not about what you inherit, but what you choose to build once it's in your hands. The storm had not ended. There would be more debts, more betrayals, more nights of fear. But I was no longer the quiet daughter in the shadows. I was the woman who carried the torch, not for show, but for light. And so I keep walking step by step, not quiet anymore.